Good morning, ladies and
który zawiera bardzo ciekawe wnioski. Robert?
Dzień dobry Państwu. Mój polski nie jest
regulatory body, rail regulating body, Schienen Control. And this year, Schienen Control has the chair of the European Network of Rail Regulating Bodies, IRG Rail. And it's been my job to coordinate that chair. And this is also the role in which I was invited. Yep. In my presentation today, I'd like to tell you about our mandate with regards to monitoring the impact of COVID-19 and the impact it had on railways and in particular the European railway market. I'll touch upon the impact the pandemic had on both passenger and freight rail transport and then address some of the measures undertaken by states to support the railway sector and to counter detrimental effects of the crisis. I'd then like to finish by looking beyond COVID and speak about some of the developments currently underway that we as regulators find interesting and potentially highly influential in the not so distant future. Our network was founded in 2011, and currently it counts 31 rail regulating bodies as its members. The network acts as a platform for cooperation, information exchange and sharing of best practice between national regulating bodies. The idea is to face current and future challenges in railways together, but also to promote a consistent application of the European regulatory framework. Our strategic goals are to promote effective and efficient regulation applied consistently in Europe, a resilient, open and sustainable railway sector, and of course best regulatory practice for the benefit of passengers and rail freight users. We see it within our mandate and also within the sector's best interest to provide reliable and clear views on key challenges such as smart and sustainable mobility, something that was discussed, I think, yesterday already at this conference, and finding new solutions for capacity management and multimodality and other issues. Strictly speaking, we as regulating bodies are not part of the legislature, but rather of the executive. Nevertheless, we consider informing legislators, particularly the European Commission, part of our mandate. While it's not within our mandate to secure the actual train runs or to make sure that the trains are on time, mine was delayed today, helping to make the railway sector in Europe a success is certainly not against our mandate either. In this vein, RG Rail has closely monitored the impact COVID-19 had on the railway sector, and this resulted in a series of publications, and I'll speak about, well, basically two of them. The 9th Market Monitoring Report, basically every year we publish a market monitoring report. And the 9th installment in April 2021 focused on COVID-19 and provided data on its impact during the first 6 months of 2020. In July 2021, we followed that up by a report which covered the whole year of 2020. And the 10th Market Monitoring Report, which is forthcoming in April next year, will include consolidated numbers and figures. And we will then have had the chance to solidify and compare data from 2 full years of pandemic, 2020 and 2021. Yeah. In 2020, we saw a significant decrease in the passenger railway market. Measured in passenger kilometers, traffic dropped 48%. However, measured in the number of departures, the decrease only amounted to 8%. And we take that as an indication of sort of the measures taken not only to support the railway sector in dire times, but it's also an indication how important railways are to maintain our societies. I think that's something you mentioned earlier. And they also indicate the importance attributed to railways as a critical infrastructure. The occupancy rate dropped by over 40%, so trains basically were a lot emptier than they are usually. I'll speak more about the specific measures taken later, but let's keep in mind for our discussion later, maybe that the railways played an important role in keeping our societies up and running, and perhaps more so than, for example, aviation. The only increase or improvement we saw came in punctuality, 2.3 percentage points for passenger trains and even 4 percentage points for freight trains. Regarding freight, the impact we saw in 2020 was far smaller, with a decrease in ton kilometers of 7% and a decrease in the number of departures of 6%. The impact quite surely was mitigated by countermeasures, or rather measures in support of the railway sector, which states took, basically public authorities. In October 2020, EU Regulation 1429 established measures for a sustainable rail market in view of COVID-19 and was adopted, and the period of reference was retrograded to March 2020. And it was important because it included temporary measures to help the railway sector stave off the detrimental effects of the pandemic, and has been extended since. It enables member states to authorize infrastructure managers to remove, postpone, or lower track access charges, while in turn ensuring state aid to the infrastructure managers to compensate them for the lost revenue. The measures taken by states included the adjustment of track access charges, whereby raw discounts, the postponing of invoicing, and discount schemes were introduced. Another measure applied quite widely across Europe was state aid to railway undertakings, which came in form of funding track access charges, the compensation of loss of revenue, or an increase in public subsidies. So basically you had support either for railway undertakings, or on the other side for infrastructure managers in various forms and shapes. 16 countries granted temporary unemployment aid and subsidized loans, or the postponement of public charges or debt. In Austria and Norway, temporary PSO contracts, which are public service obligations, were granted on parts of the network where otherwise only open access traffic occurs. On the slide, you'll see further measures applied by various member states, and all of which are described in more detail in the report, and I'm happy to talk to them a bit later. The report aside, we began engaging the issue of COVID-19 early in 2020 already. In May of 2020, we released a statement with a first take on the pandemic and its effects from a regulatory point of view, while in principle welcoming, of course, support measures for the sector taken by member states individually. We also pointed toward the potential detriments of unilateral measures and called for a better coordination of these activities. We welcomed attempts by the European Commission in coordinating measures by the member states, and we also stressed that those temporary measures should indeed be considered exceptional and not permanent. It's important to strike a balance between emergency measures and safeguarding fair competition. Apart from the overall danger that the pandemic could stifle the otherwise positive trend of the railway sector's steady growth, we also see risks connected with state aid, of course. On one hand, it may lead to a distortion of competition within the railway sector, but, and more importantly, especially in the context of our debate today, state aid may distort competition among transport modes. By this I mean, if you remember, in the early days of the pandemic, the sector, I believe, received the most aid at first was the aviation sector, and well, although there's no proof, or not available to me, there's at least a risk that this could sort of lead to an already not fully balanced playing field being tilted even more in favor of competing transport sectors such as road traffic or aviation. And already during these stages, we saw how resilient the railways were, particularly in comparison to other modes, such as road transport and the aviation sector. While trucks got stuck at the borders and planes were grounded, trains continued to deliver goods and passengers locally, regionally, and across borders. In some cases, trains were used to evacuate COVID-19 patients from highly affected regions to places where they could find better treatment and more adequate care. Now I'd like to look briefly beyond COVID and toward the future of rail transport in Europe. Measures such as investment in infrastructure to alleviate the income losses for IMs, for infrastructure managers during the pandemic, will perhaps lead to better networks, by which I mean more capacity, heightened security, shorter travel and transport times, and ideally higher punctuality. This may further be aided by attractive offers to customers, such as cheap annual network passes, recently introduced in Austria, the Klimaticket, which may be expected to lead to higher demand, both in the passenger and the freight sector. This is as much a challenge as it provides an opportunity, of course. After all, rail traffic is the most climate-friendly mass transport mode available to us. More demand will perhaps lead to more volume, which in turn will increase the competition for capacity between passenger and freight transport, which already is fierce in some areas of Europe. Other developments to keep an eye on, which could carry with them the potential for significant change within the railway sector, are the TTR project and the Rail Facility Portal. While the latter could provide transparent and easily available accessible information on all rail service facilities in Europe, the timetabling and capacity redesigning project, TTR, may completely change Europe's system of awarding railway capacity. And of course, as regulators, we follow these and other projects and developments closely. Now, coming to an end, let me finish by saying, as regulators, we believe that railways are essential to the sustainable recovery from COVID-19 and the pandemic, and will play a key role in meeting the challenges presented by the climate crisis. I'd like to end my presentation here and look forward to a discussion with you, and especially about what role railways can play in the future, especially with the climate crisis in mind. All right. Dziękuję. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much.
Proszę Państwa, teraz...
Ladies and gentlemen,
Teraz, proszę Państwa, czas
now over to Polish perspective, a perspective that we've studied as part of our tasks as the Center for EU Transport Projects. I'll try to briefly present my presentation and focus on the main conclusions from the study that we've carried out. There were two elements that we were looking at. First, four surveys on our core business. That is, what is the impact of the pandemic on the implementation of projects for the financing of which we are responsible. Those surveys were conducted in spring and autumn last year, and we are going to do it this year as well. This is becoming our tradition now. Not sure how long this will continue, but hopefully there will come a time where it will not be necessary to continue this tradition. Anyway, those delays which are presented as being caused by the pandemic, their scale is going down by over 1/3 compared to April 2020. We don't yet have results of the autumn survey 2021. The reasons are quite intuitive. On the one hand, we are talking about people getting sick, but it's also about people getting quarantined. It's also about the necessity to ensure care for children in online schooling. This actually affected us as ZUPT as well. Changing of the lockdown conditions, it was all very unpredictable. Also, we are facing a situation in which the pandemic caused a lot of changes for which we were not ready.
Natomiast drugą częścią,
And the second part
którą realizowaliśmy, było badanie,
of what we did, I mean,
to jest badanie
was a study that isn't finished yet. It's a study of the impact of pandemic on public transport in cities. It's obvious that this situation that started in March 2020
wywróciła, można powiedzieć, przynajmniej częściowo do góry nogami nasze wyobrażenie o codziennym funkcjonowaniu.
completely turned around our way of thinking about functioning day to day, and it completely changed the public transport. You can remember last year limitations on the number of passengers per rolling stock unit of rolling stock. The obligation to wear face masks was introduced. Unfortunately, sometimes we are forgetting about it, but there were also responses to that. I mean, there was limited service of public transport. There were cost issues on the part of operators and organizers. What we wanted to do is we wanted to try to see how this situation will impact our projects, and is it a part of a wider context? I mean, because what we are doing, what we are implementing is not hanging in a vacuum. It's a part of a larger whole, especially in urban conditions. It's a part of what you could call urban
Popatrzyliśmy na to z perspektywy tego,
urban network. We were looking at the planning of projects.
Oprócz tego
on top of that, we also used surveys. Those polls or surveys were addressed to cities as transport organizers as well as residents. We used data from Google Maps, we used econometric analyses as well as traditional evaluation tools such as individual interviews and expert panels. What are the conclusions, at least initially?
Pierwszy punkt wskazujący na brak
Number one,
strategii jest troszkę takim stwierdzeniem oczywistym. Kiedy 2 lata temu
there are no strategies, crisis strategies for public transport. When 2.5 years ago, when you'd say within 12 months or 18 months, something will happen that will lock down certain countries for a month or two, that we will be locked down in our homes, that whenever possible we'll start working online, you know, most of us would be looking with a surprised look at the author of such words, and he would suggest that he would start maybe writing science fiction novels. The reality proved this approach wrong, and the lack of crisis strategies caused this problem. Instability of regulations also had an impact, because during the pandemic we were learning throughout the process. As regards the change of behaviors, we'll see how those behaviors will become permanent. continents. So you can already see some trends. The positive trend that appeared in larger agglomerations with passengers using more and more public transport, those trends were disrupted. Some of those passengers are coming back to individual transport. Not all of them, but they do. What's also important is that a return to individual transport that does not necessarily have to be related with the pandemic, but certainly what happened in 2020 had a lot of influence on that. But, for example, the current situation of fuel prices may cause a reverse trend. A very interesting thing about payments. All forms of electronic payments became really popular. And what's interesting, the number of long-term tickets sold fell. We started using single tickets. Myself, I moved in the meantime, but I stopped using long-term tickets because I didn't have to go to work. And we are working in a hybrid mode in my organization, and simply a long-term ticket is no longer economical. It makes more sense to use a single ticket, and I usually use an app for that. So I am an example of these changes. What's also interesting is that many times the trip times became longer due to increased car traffic. The car traffic increase could be observed primarily from the beginning of September this year, when schools came back to regular mode. So that's it for quick conclusions. In a minute, we'll start our discussion, and we'll be able to tell you more, or try to look for answers to the question to which extent this situation will continue, how does Polish transport change after the pandemic of COVID-19. Right, so what we need is just 15 seconds to rearrange our area, which we are about to do ourselves.
And I would also like to invite today's guests of our conference who will take part in the discussion session. So I would like to invite Mr. Marcin Domański, representing the Communication and Transport Department in the Silesian Metropolis. So you are in this convenient situation that you can choose the seat you prefer. And I would also like to invite Michał Jaworski, representing the Office of Railway Transport. Also, my invitation goes to Robert Kogler from IRG, who's just left, probably going to return in a moment. Another participant is Marcin Żabicki, the Development Director in the Chamber of Urban Transport. And also, I would like to invite our remote guests, which include Mircea Steriu, representing the International Association of Public Transport, and Mr. Janusz Malinowski, the president of the Łódź Agglomeration Railway. Can we see and hear each other? Let me just confirm that. We can see the participants, the remote participants, but we cannot hear them.
Hello? Yes. Yes, we can.
Słyszymy pana stereo,
Panie prezesie, czy się słyszymy?
but can you hear us? Oh,
Okej, my pana
okay.
prezesa
So
też
now we
słyszymy.
can also hear the representative of the Łódź Agglomeration Railway, the president of that organization. So the
Zanim przejdziemy do trzeciej
final
prezentacji,
technical
którą
touch-up before
będziemy
we
mieli
move on to the
przyjemność
third
dzisiaj
presentation.
obejrzeć i wysłuchać. Pierwsze dwa pytania.
But
I chciałbym
let me
spytać,
start with a round of questions.
Michała Jaworskiego,
First question to Mr. Michał Jaworski from the Office of
jak
Railway
ta
Transport.
sytuacja covidowa wpłynęła na transport
In
kolejowy
what
w
way
Polsce? Pan
the
Robert przedstawił
COVID
nam
situation
tutaj,
affect
pewne
the
dane ogólne
railway
tendencje.
transport in Poland?
to
We
wynika
heard
tutaj
some general
Dzień dobry, szanowni
information
państwo.
about the European situation. What was it like in Poland? Good morning. My name is Michał Jaworski. I'm responsible for monitoring the market and for collecting statistics in this respect. So probably I'm the right person to offer you a response to that question.
Jeśli chodzi, inaczej wyglądała sytuacja.
Definitely, the situation touched differently the transport part and the cargo part of railway services. As regards the passenger transport, in the recent years there was a variety of activities supporting that part of transport, the purchasing of new rolling stock, renovation of railways, so new infrastructure, and all that caused the number of passengers to increase between 2014 and 2019. And in 2019 we had 335 million passengers a year, and then 2020 came and the number of passengers dropped by 37.7 to 209 million passengers only. And obviously that was due to the lockdowns, other restrictions, remote schools, remote work. And passengers simply had no reason to continue using railway transport. On the other hand, as regards the cargo transport, the decrease in 2020 amounted only to 5.6% in relation to 2019. The goods had to be transported still. Well, there were industries that stopped operation, obviously, and for example, the furniture industry in Poland and motoring industry, these industries were heavily affected. Also, much less coal was transported in 2020. Less animal fodder and fertilizers. However, the railway transport of goods had to continue despite the closure of borders between countries. And as regards intermodal transport, it even gained somewhat because the intermodality was in fact boosted in 2020, and the second quarter turmoil did not stop the increase. So the transport the shipping companies, even when China locked down their factories and the ships had no goods to transport, the shipping companies started to shift from ships to railways, and that mode even became more popular. And so let me just tell you what is the current status in November 2021 in respect of intermodal transport. Today on our website we published information for quarter 3 of 2021.
za dużo mówił. Powiem
So
tylko,
I
że
will not maybe discuss it in extension, but in 3 quarters of 2021, we already see more cargo transported in intermodal transport than in the entire 2020.
Jeśli chodzi o transport
Now,
pasażerski,
as regards passenger
we wrześniu
transport,
mieliśmy
in
25
September we
milionów
had
pasażerów.
25 million
W październiku jest to
passengers. In
bardzo
October,
zbliżona do
that was
27
the
milionów.
value already
To jest
near
najwyższa wartość
27
od,
million passengers,
lutego
the highest number since February 2020, which was
pandemicznym poziomem liczby
the
pasażerów.
last pre-pandemic month. And so despite the fourth wave of COVID, the passenger traffic is returning to the levels from before the pandemic. Now regarding the cargo transport, in the same period of previous year, we had the total mass transported between January and October was 183 million tons. In this year, in the same period, we already had 201 million tons, which is also better than in 2019, which was entirely a pre-pandemic year, because between January and October 2019 we only had 199 million tons. So slowly we are getting back and in shape, and I hope the trend will continue.
Drugie pytanie, które jeszcze chciałbym,
And my second question,
poprzedziło naszą,
with which I would like to precede our last presentation, is addressed first to President Janusz Malinowski as the representative of the carrier, of the passenger carrier. So how far are we already equipped with appropriate procedures which safeguard against such situations as pandemic COVID-19? So how far are we prepared on the level of careers for situations of that sort?
Nie słyszymy.
And the managers of rolling stock and operators and managers of electricity suppliers are already well prepared. For the procedures were developed in February 2020. We could already see at that time what we were up for, and very quickly the principles were established, the new principles were established, and so definitely we were also learning on the job how to handle the dynamic situation, and so procedures were constantly updated. New cleaning regimes were introduced. So basically, we doubled the frequency and cleaning. So 7 times a day, in fact, we currently clean our rolling stock, which was intended to ensure better safety. We simplified the system of ticket inspection and the matter of the automatic door opening only by the train operators. We also established separate zones within trains. Also, we tried to make sure that the teams of our personnel also worked in a way that would make them avoid too much contact. Also, the managers of electricity suppliers were simply moved to live in barracks outside of their families in order to ensure that the provision of electricity is continued. So every month, in fact, we had to update the rules. We were learning on the go, but today I can say that we are quite well prepared for cases like that.
Przewoźnika przenieśmy się na chwilę.
So from the level of a carrier, let us move on to the level of a national regulator. And Michał, my question to you, what does it look like from your point of view? Are we already prepared for a situation like that?
Jesteśmy przygotowani, ponieważ sami się
Well, I think we are, because we also learned on the go, and we had to respond to the dynamic situation.
Oczywiście powinny być
And obviously,
reżim sanitarny.
the sanitary regime, in my opinion, should be maintained in order to make passengers feel safe when traveling on our trains.
Żeby w każdym momencie
So that at any given moment, passengers could get on the train without additional fear. The carriers should definitely react at the moments of heavier passenger traffic, so in the morning and in the evening, when the passenger when trains get crowded or tend to get crowded, and they should react accordingly to that with more trains or in other ways regulate the occupancy. But well, definitely procedures like that have already been developed, so I think we are ready in this respect as well. So let us have a look at the same situation from the European point of view. Robert, what is the situation like as regards the cooperation between the managers, regulators in all member states in general?
Chyba jak się mówi po angielski. Huh? It's easier. All right. Okay. Yeah. The European perspective. The thing is that it's maybe the one uniting factor is that countries and states reacted so differently. So the situation is quite varied across Europe, I would say. I mean, whereas you in some or in most places you had somewhat reduced traffic, there's one country which I should find out where traffic sort of in terms of trains running was actually increased to create more space on trains. So that was a measure too. So member states reacted quite differently to and also the sort of the return of passengers to train and to railways it varies across Europe, and of course it's a consequence of how the pandemic situation is in the various places. So I don't think there is, let's say, one situation. It's various situations in Europe, and I'm not sure. Obviously, railways are, as critical infrastructure, they sort of play an important role in the pandemic, but of course they cannot solve the overall. So it's not that, COVID-19 will go away because the railways perform better. But railways need to adapt, and I think I agree with Michał and with others that yes, the railways have adapted in terms of, what was mentioned now, especially hygiene on trains, etc. But let's say the pandemic, I believe, will go away at some point, but we will still be left with other challenges such as the climate crisis, and then that's where the railways will really need to step up and improve in what they do, and improve in terms of services, improve in so many ways to make sure that people and also freight shippers are ready to choose railways over let's say more pollutant modes of transport.
Dziękuję bardzo. To jest, proszę Państwa, też bardzo ciekawy wniosek.
It's also a very interesting conclusion that every country responded differently, and results of that will be seen in the next presentation. Before we go on to this presentation, I'd like to ask one question to which we will return after this presentation. Did we lose trust in public transport? So let me leave this question open for now, and now I'd like to invite Mircea Steriu from the International Association of Public Transport to give his presentation, a presentation, as I have seen, containing very interesting information.
The floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you, everybody, and good morning. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I hope that I will be able to give you some brief highlights of how the impact of COVID-19 has reverberated throughout the urban public transport sector. Let me very, very quickly, for those in the audience or also for those on the panel who do not know very well who UITP is, I will give you a quick introduction to the association and the specific exercise that I'll present. And after that, I'm going to go ahead and show you the different impact of the pandemic in different cities. Hopefully, while I go through this presentation, I'll be able to answer some of the questions. Definitely the one that you've launched over there. Actually, for those who don't know, UITP, the International Association of Public Transport, is a membership-based organization founded actually more than 135 years ago, and we gather all the different sectors of urban mobility. So we have the public transport operators, and I'm pretty sure that some of you are members of UITP already. I'd like to thank you for that. We do have authorities as members. So these are the city and metropolitan area governments or transport departments who are organizing mobility, but we also have supplying industry. So people such as Solaris Bus in Poland are, of course, one of the very good and valuable members of UITP. And under this wide umbrella, our mission is to advocate and provide knowledge and to be an exchange platform for our members to be able to promote public transport. So, of course, when COVID first hit our sector and our cities and our world in general, what UITP has done was to put together a task force, which was looking at how us as an organization could support the sector. We are working to on a weekly basis identify and initiate various activities which are supporting the sector, and very, very specifically on what I am doing, and the exercise that I've coordinated since the beginning of the crisis was to look at the impact of ridership. So if you go to the next slide, I'm already going to be able to show you how this has impacted the world. Now, of course, as you may know, March 2020, what happened was everything went into lockdown. So everything but the most restricted travel, the most necessary travel was allowed. Our cities became ghost cities, and you had all of the photos absolutely everywhere of plazas, of shops, of roads not being driven on or used by anyone. Of course, as the first wave of the pandemic more or less subsided, there was a tentative a tentative recovery throughout the summer and to some extent the autumn of 2020, where measures were relaxed, leading to what was then considered to be a new normal. And if you look at the various labels on the graphs, you see how the restrictions were lifted gradually. I'm showing the example of London in the UK, but I do have several other cities which have gone through the same process with more or less similar effects on the level of ridership obtained. So what we are doing is to track how ridership as recorded through validations of tickets has been recorded in a certain week of the year compared to what was supposed to be the normal expected ridership level for that time of the year. So it's taking into account various seasonal influences, various like holiday periods and as such. And you'll see that, of course, as then what came to be known as the second wave of the pandemic followed, and there was an increase in the number of cases and hospitalizations. New measures had to be taken and to be imposed, leading to a second lockdown, which in England was a little bit quicker. So you see its effects here before Christmas or of 2020 already. In several of the other European countries, this happened after the New Year's holiday, but largely throughout the beginning of 2021. And if you can switch to the next slide as well. Already by now, by the beginning of 2021, most of the European countries were already in were in some form of lockdown. Now, what this meant, of course, was that ridership was severely depressed basically throughout the spring of 2021, and then the main game changer during this period was first of all the approval and then the start of mass vaccination rollout campaign. So if we're looking as 2021 has further progressed, you see that as of May of 2021, because a large percentage of the population had received the vaccine dose already, or sometimes even the full vaccination schedule, some measures starting to be released. All of this culminating sometime during the summer, so weeks 25 to 35 of this year, when largely all of the countries, including Poland, have almost reversed all of the measures that had been taken. So basically, we had no restrictions that were being imposed on the number of people who could meet or where they could meet. All of this, of course, so this gradual relaxation leading to the increase in the observed levels of ridership on public transport services. However, as you can see from the graph, which goes up to largely 2 weeks ago. That's the most recent data that I currently have available to me. You see that we are still far away from a recovery and what was supposed to a full recovery and what was supposed to be expected in terms of the number of passengers on public transport services. So this, of course, has not been the case only in London, as you will be familiar. This is the case in many cities in Poland as well. And I do receive regular updates from your colleagues in Warsaw. But we can also move to the other cities to try and show you a little bit the same. If you can move to the next slide, please. What we have seen, so I'm showing you Dijon in France, which is a relatively small city, but the reason I'm showing I have chosen this city is because of a certain pattern that we are noticing in the ridership and evolution data. So I'm not going to go through highlighting the entire pattern and what has happened, what was the sanitary situation throughout 2020 and 2021. What I want you to take out of both this slide and the next one is that in a city which is slightly smaller, you do have a large level of you do have recovery which is coming a little bit more fast. So you have more people returning to public transport services in smaller cities. Then in an interesting but a not very positive case, as you may know, lots of cities in Asia were actually very, very good in combating the virus throughout 2020. And for Taipei, you see that ridership on the metro service was actually at 90%, so nearly at comparable levels. With pre-pandemic times throughout 2020. If you can move to the next slide, though. But this street period, so during which the country was able to contain the virus, actually showed that any recovery continues to be very, very fragile, especially while new variant of the virus occurs. So if you see already, this was the month of May and continuing throughout the rest of this year, when there was a huge outbreak in the country, despite its previous good record of managing infections, which then led to a very strict lockdown, and then measures were only released very, very gradually, as in the other cities. If we can move to the other slide, please. One back. There you go. Same basic situation in American cities, so North America. I'm showing New York because it's a big international city to which many of us can relate. But the data seen from New Jersey, from Washington D.C., or even the Canadian cities, so from Montreal, from Vancouver, shows largely the same pattern, where following the very sharp drop in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, despite the fact that many of the measures had been released throughout the summer, ridership has never really returned, and this can be in part due to the very, very pronounced work from home evolution. So you do have a large number of the people who would be riding the New York subway or the New York buses, who, whenever given the chance, they remained and took advantage of the work from home possibilities, which is why they didn't really return to the services. If we can move to the next slide as well. We did have also a very strong impact in the United States of the method of schooling, where quite a lot of the public schools were remained in remote learning mode throughout the school year of 2020 to 2021, which also led to lower ridership levels. And now moving into this year, you see that we observe the same pattern, where despite the fact that quite a lot of the restrictions have been removed, and despite the fact that there hasn't been a significant spike in cases in the US throughout this fall. So what we have, the increasing cases that we see now in European cities is not there in the United States, at least not for the moment. You still see that ridership recovery is much below what was expected to be seen at this time of the year. So I can talk for hours about these graphs, and I can go into the nitty-gritty details. But I would like to leave you with a few um, points and lessons for the future. Firstly, there is always an indirect effect of the measures that are taken on ridership. So, indeed, in the very beginning of the crisis, the communication was public transport can be a vector of transmission. UITP has tracked the research and looked at a number of studies that have been conducted since then, and the message is always the same. Whenever you have outbreaks of the virus, these do not occur in public transport, and in and of itself, due to the increased cleaning, due to the increased and improved ventilation in vehicles and in stations, due to the measures to wear masks, it's not a significant factor for infection. What really impacts ridership is the strength of the lockdown. So when you have a very strict lockdown, you can expect about between 5 and 20% of the people still using public transport. If significant measures and schools are being taken and schools are closed, you can expect around 20 to 30% of your normal ridership levels. If gatherings are allowed to some extent, but you still have significant limit, basically ridership should still remain under 50% of the normal. And then once you do have most of the restrictions removed, ridership is expected to go to about 60% and over of the ridership levels. And also a few more interesting trends that we've taken from the various city. So I've already talked, and we have to make sure that this message is being repeated over and over again, that our sector is not a significant vector for the virus. And then, of course, recovery remains fragile to new outbreaks, and the data that we see from the Asian cities bears this out. Then what is also interesting to see, and I was listening very carefully to the presentation that you had about railway services beforehand. So you do have recovery being different in different parts of the city, and also it does look, and you've seen in the graphs I shown, it does look that metros are taking a little bit longer. So they're recovering at a slower pace. That is not because of the vehicle itself, that is because of the type of service. So when you have a network that is, or a line that is primarily serving the purpose of bringing people from the outsides or from sleeper cities, from the outskirts of the city into the city center, basically the classic, let's say, central business district model, these types of services recover passengers a little bit more slowly than orbital lines or than feeder lines. As I mentioned with the case of Dijon, in smaller cities, we do have faster recovery than in the larger ones. Part of this is also restrictions on travel, where you do have a lot of tourist travelers who would be more inclined to take public transport in a city, who are still not there. So I know that in New York, they are really suffering in terms of tourists, and they were also small but significant part of ridership. And then, interestingly, when we're looking at the more detailed analysis of ridership during the weekend, we do see the recovery levels being there at pre-pandemic levels. So work from home is and policies that support it and that encourage it are likely to have a long-lasting effect on ridership level. I will leave you at this, and I'm happy to answer more questions as they come. I hope that I was able to answer your open question, but happy to participate in the rest of the panel as well. Thank you.
Dziękujemy bardzo za tą prezentację. Proszę Państwa, mieliśmy tutaj przykłady nawet już nie z Europy, z całego
Well, ladies and
świata.
gentlemen, we've just heard examples not only from Europe but from across the world, and the question remains: what is it like in Poland? Have we lost our trust in public transport, or has it recovered? Maybe I will address my question to Marcin Żabicki, as the representatives of the Chamber of Urban Transport, which collects such information on the national level. So what is it like in Poland? Thank you for the invitation, and I have to confirm that what we've seen in the presentation of Mircea Steriu is exactly what we observe in Poland. So the trend is different in small cities, so there are two speeds, different in small and different in larger cities. So the structure of the public transport in the town of Szczecinek, for example, very small town, 40% that would be school children, another 40% seniors traveling with free travel cards. And less than 20% would be all other passengers who are more randomly using that mode of transport. And in those small towns, the levels have returned to almost that from pre-pandemic period, but the trend in the long-term trend is also decreasing, because there are fewer young people staying in small cities, and the few young people, the fewer students, and the fewer passengers on trains. Well, we also could see a very nice graph or bar indicating 60% plus, that is the number of passengers from the pre-pandemic period. So we know very little about the remaining 40%, probably working in various remote ways. Others have switched to their own cars for a variety of reasons. But however much I would like to answer this question, but we are not really able to tell with any certainty what was the reason for the absence. But there may be a variety of factors, including the prices of fuel, which were far lower at the end of 2020 even, and people were using individual transport to a greater extent. We also can see the phenomenon of, as we call it, Uberization of public transport. So, for example, urban bicycles were very popular until scooters came into use, for example, and so all sorts of new app-based modes of transport, which unfortunately also frequently involve the very cheap labor. So if you use Uber, you will immediately see that these are mostly immigrants, even no longer from Ukraine, but from further east, from Asia. Apart from that, we could see a very severe impact of the closure of schools currently on the reliability of such studies. So we are not conducting studies like that simply because the situation is so dynamically changing, and it would be difficult to collect any reliable information. But have people lost the trust? Well, looking at the people still present on buses or subways, definitely not, but it's hard to say what happened to those who are not there. Well, as you said, small cities have seen a faster recovery of public transport than major cities, but that is unexpected, because I could expect it to go the other way around. Let me then ask Marcin Domański, also referring to that trust question and a bit touching on the ways in which we plan transport. I am convinced that previously, when we were developing transport plan, we were not making any provisions for the events like this. This outflow of people from public transport, can we at all pre-plan for that, and should we do it? Well, there should definitely be always a crisis plan due to two things. First of all, the public transport should always allow us to go to a bus stop, for example, and without looking to the watch, there should always be some bus coming. But it changed completely during the pandemic because the frequency had to be readjusted, and so people stopped traveling to offices, but the industrial part of town would still be operating. So we were missing a system of counting passengers that would help us restructure that network of connections. There were no procedures like that. So even I myself had to count passengers on individual bus stops in order to establish how often should buses travel from that stop. Even the lady from the newsstand next to that bus stop started to offer me tea after a few days of my counting people there. But we were also missing the elasticity in the tariffs. So, for example, a certain number of travels during a certain period of time instead of just a monthly travel pass. But now we can see that a lot of people are returning to offices, schools, plenty of the traffic in towns seen again. And as regards the trust, this fear of contagion is probably already gone. That's what you can judge from how often people use the mask or not. So definitely what we need to be prepared for is to be more flexible in shaping the network of connections and make it reliable still. During the pandemic, people started to get to know their nearest surroundings because they stopped traveling far. They started to go to shops that were closer to the place of. And if I don't buy a monthly pass, then it probably means that I will tend to use my own car more often. That was one of the questions. On the other hand, we could see very few cars in the street, but periodically. And because of that decreased traffic, the speed of traveling increased, and a lot of accidents started emerging. So the president had an idea to take out one of the lanes and they reserve it for buses in order to slow artificially that traffic down. But we had to draw conclusions of the goal, and we also heard that subway also lost its significance, including in New York, even though it is the basic mode of transport. Even though from the European eye it may seem a bit dilapidated, but the emergency scenarios are very welcome, and to ensure flexibility for the traffic system, we now are conducting a tender procedure for a system of counting passengers. And as regards a more broader look, this is a bit outside of the public transport, but it involves the entire urban mobility, the accessibility to green areas, because the green areas have become places of high interest during lockdown, and that's a necessity to provide traffic there.
Okay, so companies started making pandemic offers, relying on the fear of contagion in public transport. In a way, we cooperated with them because it was about they transported public services, they transported medical people, medics to work. So we believe that all the tools that we've developed in a natural way, pandemic forced us to create an emergency transport system, but we had to have a scheme for management. So we are moving towards, the future should be in a flexible public transport. I'm not saying transport at on demand or at request, but it should be more flexible.
Yeah. I'd like to return or speak to this question of trust in public transport, and then to something that you mentioned, which sort of made me think of something. Obviously, I can't answer whether trust has been lost or not, but there are certain indications. I can report from Austria, where the so-called climate ticket has been introduced recently, which is an annual pass valid for all public transport in Austria for €3 per day, which is rather cheap. And sales are 2 weeks ago or so were around 130,000, which is a lot by Austrian standards. So that would be an indicator that if you have interesting offer, that there will be demand. Obviously, because we're on lockdown, we can't really use it right now, but that's another question. But it also points to something you mentioned when sort of you go to a bus stop, you want a bus to arrive, of course, and you don't want to spend much time waiting. And I think it's a combination. Obviously, you need the offer in terms of frequency needs to be there and needs to be attractive. But I recently took my family on a trip to Barcelona, and we did it by train using the Interrail ticket, the good old Interrail ticket. And if, I don't know who of you ever went on an Interrail trip, basically it gives you a pass valid on all trains in Europe. And the nice thing about it is that you don't have to worry about, how much does this cost, where do I get my ticket from, etc. You buy it once, and then you just, you hop on any train you like to. And I think if you have things like that, it sort of, at least it reduces any barrier or sort of second thought of should I take public transport or not, because there's nothing additional for you to do to get a ticket. And so I think that's important too. Service frequency is important, but the way we sort of tickets should be easily available, or ideally passes, as you mentioned, the passes for senior citizens in this small place. I mean, once you don't have to think about whether this costs you extra, it might increase the likelihood of you using public transport.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you. Now a question to Mr. Janusz Malinowski. What about the loss of trust or recovery of trust? What's your perspective of a local transport operator, and how does this influence your plans? Because the Łódź agglomeration rail is known for its dynamic development. Thank you for this question. I, in general, agree with my predecessors. Many of you said things with which I agree. Let me just start by saying that last year there was a survey, and they asked people, why do you travel less? And 20% was indeed fear of being sick, but 50% was because I'm on remote work or remote schooling. So, question about public transport trust. I think people do trust public transport. Łódź agglomeration rail, we have full monitoring of the number of passengers, and it's online, live. We can see how many passengers there are in each train at any time. So we can see that on the weekends, passengers returned much quicker. This proves that, I mean, these people are on remote work and schooling. So I think we would choose the path of increasing frequency, improving the offer, because also in this study we've asked a question, what would make you come back to public transport quicker? In the first place, the response was frequency, improved offer. 28% of respondents said this would be the cause, even it scored more than ticket prices. And 10% of people said that they would come back if the media would say that it's safe. Thanks to improving frequency, from May this year, month-on-month, so I mean, comparing 2019 to 2021, we have more passengers. In 10 months, we've achieved the result of 2019, and in September, October, we are talking about 20% more passengers than in 2019. But this is due to improved offer. And I do agree that simple ticketing systems will facilitate and will motivate people who never used public transport to use this form of transport. So this, I think, is the opportunity. And I think this is the conclusion of the pandemic. So this would be an evidence that if you increase frequency, you can really quickly increase the number of passengers. Because we keep improving our offer, and we are planning more investments. And in March, April 2020, with really hard lockdown, we limited number of trains, especially where we saw the greatest decrease in passenger flows. So it's very important for us to get live information on the response of passengers and the approach of passengers to public transport. So the conclusion for Poland would be, I mean, Poland has very poor performance in terms of public transport. So that's 8.7 trips per person, then that's data of 2019. In 2020 it was 5.5, and that's twice as little as the European average. So we have a lot of room to catch up there. And I believe that improving availability, improved frequency, full integration of urban tariffs. So this is the way we should go. And this provides an opportunity for us to very quickly come back to the situation before pandemic. You've also discussed small versus big towns and cities, and I think the biggest factor there, the biggest factor in terms of the difference, is the remote work. Thank you very much. I think this question is starting to evolve. Did we lose trust? Maybe we didn't lose trust in public transport. Instead, our customs changed in terms of work. And then they changed so much that our demand, our need to use public transport changed. So do we need to encourage people to come back to public transport? And I'd like to address this question to Mircea Steriu. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. To answer directly, yes, of course, we need to encourage people to come back to public transport, and I will link back immediately to what the previous speaker was saying. We can only get people to come back to public transport if we make it easier for them. And to this effect, I actually want to focus on some of the very interesting developments that came out of the pandemic. And he mentioned it as well for Lodz, that you have an automatic monitoring of how many passengers there are in any vehicle at any time. All of these were pipe dreams in various cities, and I know in Denmark they were trying to implement such system. In Barcelona they were trying to, and everybody said, "Oh, it's very difficult to introduce such a system. It's going to take years and years until we can bring something like this to market." But when the crisis hit, and when there was a real demand from passengers to be able to actually know how many people were in the vehicle, and I have to agree, this was because of the fear, this was because of the restrictions on the number of passengers allowed on board during the let's say early releases of restrictions. These systems were brought to market very quickly, so the crisis was seen as an opportunity, and it made public transport way more comfortable to use for the average user afterwards. And this is what happens with almost any type of development which improves the lives of others. We've had the same thing with contactless payments. Everybody was saying that it's very difficult to implement. Of course it is, but it makes it easier for people to be able to take public transport. If everybody has a bank card by now, if you're able to have your ticket on the same support as your bank card, you don't have to worry where you're going to find your ticket. Of course, it's going to be easier, and all of these are indeed those little differentials, let's say, which will motivate people to come back or to use public transport for the same time. But it's not. But one extra word of caution, and I mentioned it in my presentations, and all of you saw it with personal examples from your own line of work. The work from home is going to continue to affect public transport for a long while, and it's going to affect it in terms of who is the basic person who is riding public transport. And for a long time, and many of the networks, especially in the US, that's why I focused on that example, they were built, and the frequencies were built to bring 9 to 5 office workers from the outskirts of town into the cities. We're going to have to fight as a sector in order to capture a different type of customer, because that commuter who comes into the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, that is not going to be the main profile of person who will take public transport. That's why we have to focus more on providing more accessibility, linking suburb to suburb or neighborhood to neighborhood rather than neighborhood to center all of the time, making the offer more integrated, as it was mentioned by the other speakers. All of these are little differentials which will need to be taken into account in order to actually recover the number of passengers. At one point, maybe it would be good from a paradigm point of view to stop saying bring people back, because there are other people that we are now trying to also convince to use public transport. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. W Pana wypowiedzi pojawiło się bardzo wiele wątków i tutaj to ostatnie zdanie bardzo mi się podobało właśnie, że też żebyśmy nie mówili o zachęcaniu do powrotu.
Thank you very much for that. Well, we heard that we should not really continue talking about encouraging people to come back to public transport, but maybe encourage new users simply because the changed paradigms of working and learning. Now, considering the new elements in the offer of the passenger transport that appeared, in this context, we talked at the meeting of the Chamber of Urban Transport, and we were analyzing the ways to encourage passengers to return. Well, then the fourth wave came. Still, we operate in a different way than during the previous waves. The proof is even today in this room, we can meet physically despite the peak. So the question, however, remains open: how to continue encouraging people to use the public transport, those who need to move from place to place, to opt for this mode of transport rather than anything else. Thank you very much for that very good question, but a difficult one as well. Well, we talked, as you mentioned, but it was 3 months ago, and already the situation has changed. And there is no one way to get people back onto buses and trains. It has to be a mixed approach, including some publicity. There always needs to be some promotion, but then there is a question of financing of such outreach, because we have to remember that public transport is always relying on subsidies, on the public budget, regional budget, and there is never enough money, and such publicity campaigns are usually treated as something going beyond our normal task. Besides, another way is to discourage people from using individual transport, making narrower streets, limiting the parking places in city centers, or increasing tariffs. And I cannot see too many examples in Polish cities that municipal authorities go in that direction, and I'm really interested to help the public transport. In fact, in many towns, we see that things have reversed. People are afraid of encouraging passengers to use public transport simply because there are still so many people believing, even among the authorities, that it's safer to go by your own car, simply. And the third area would be to attract passengers with a good offer. So I would like to repeat what the president of the Łódź Railway service said, that if there is a very good supply, it could generate better demand. But how should we fund that improved supply? We are in a situation of a dire financial crisis as well, which is probably affecting all member states in Europe to a higher or lesser degree. But we also in Poland have a very dramatic expectations regarding the regional budget.
będą
and there will be serious cuts
jeszcze my nie wiemy, jak one będą głębokie.
going deep,
Ale to
and we
jeśli
don't know
rząd
how
będą
deep
kończyć,
yet,
nam się jeszcze w
but
tej chwili wydaje.
unfortunately
Tu nie ma możliwości
I'm afraid they will
właściwie
go deeper than we
mówieniu, żeby
expect.
polepszyć ofertę. To
So
jest bardziej pytanie, jak
talking about
minimalizować
improving the offer may easily change into a question how to minimize losses in the offer.
Bardzo byśmy
It's a bit pessimistic, unfortunately. We would like very much to improve it, but won't do much without proper financing. And there are other aspects which contribute to the difficulty of the situation. So, for example, the two challenges very of high currency in our industry, including the low emission propulsion, also very costly to replace. In Poland, we have European support for that purpose, but in Austria, in Germany, for example, it's no longer as easy. And the other aspect is that this really is a dramatic moment regarding the human resources. The inflation that we've been going through has caused really increased in in salary expectations. So public transport personnel is very quickly leaving the services. I'm looking to the gentleman from Silesia. Will you be at all able to maintain your offer? I'm not talking about money for new rolling stock, low emission buses, but are you able to keep your drivers to supply that service? Because I doubt it. Well, whiff of pessimism in that picture, but floor goes to Robert.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add one small thing which I thought of. I noticed that we're only men here, no women, unfortunately, on this panel. But obviously, we're also all grown-ups. But I think we should think of, when we speak about finding new customers, new users of public transport, we need to look at children and the way they grow up and which modes of transport they grow up with. I think that's an important thing. Every school child, I mean, the more often a child is brought to school by a car, the less likely it is that it will, not use a car to get to work later, I guess. So I think that's something we need to encourage. I think it works. I guess it works well in Poland anyway. But there are places where the sort of the default way of getting children from A to B is putting them in a car and driving them there.
Dziękuję bardzo. Państwo tego nie widzą, natomiast nam tutaj wyświetla się taki zegar, który nie
Thank you for that. You cannot see that, but we have also a clock ticking, which is already nearing the end of this session. That's why I would like to give you 1 minute to respond to this. If we wanted to build a SWOT analysis for the transport, for the public transport in the future, so one strength and that you could point to, and some most important threats to public transport in this COVID era. The first would be Michał Jaworski.
Mocna strona transportu
The strength that I would see in public transport still
Mocną stroną jest
is
jego w dalszym ciągu
its continued predictability.
W erze pandemii
We know that
było to
during the peak of pandemic, public transport was used less frequently, but still, when people wanted to move, to go from Warsaw to Gdańsk, from Warsaw to Szczecin, they still could use a train for that purpose and travel that distance. So even in the period of lockdown, public buses and subway was still in operation. And the threat, so predictability. And the threat is that
Świat przez te niecałe 2 lata bardzo
over
poszedł
the
do przodu.
last
Świat
2 years, the
dojrzał,
world has
dojrzały myśli
matured very much,
ideę europejskiego
and
zielonego ładu. Teraz,
new ideas of
kiełkuje
green
to w umysłach
European
pasażerów.
Green Deal have
Teraz
emerged.
pasażerowie oczekują
And
od
the
transportu,
passengers expect
czegoś
public
więcej. Oni
transport
chcą
to
być
offer something
smart,
more.
chcą mieć
They
szybko,
want the transport to
szybciej
be smart.
informacje,
They want the
mobilni,
information to be
działają
provided in
na
real time on their mobile
Transport
phones.
publiczny musi się do tych
So
oczekiwań
public transport
dostosować,
has to
musi być
adjust
szybszy,
to the
bardziej
new
dopasowany,
expectations
bardziej
of the
elastyczny
users.
i,
We need to be more
po prostu
flexible in
dogarnąć,
reacting to those
oczekiwania, ponieważ
expectations
jesteśmy
and
w
catch
innej
up with them. We are
rzeczywistości.
living
Wrócimy
already
do
in a
tego,
different
co
reality.
wiemy.
We will not go back to
Praca
whatever
zdalna, nauka
was
zdalna.
in the times before COVID. The remote work, remote schooling is going to stay with us for quite some time, and we need to catch up with the new situation. So thank you for that, Marcin Domański. 1 minute for you. Now, that would depend which point of view we take, because public transport, if the public transport is the tool to use the number of individual cars, and we all want it to happen, then definitely we arrive at a bit of paradox talking about threat. If the remote work reduced the occupancy on trains, it would definitely it's become easier to use your own car. And then if people use their own cars, we cannot expect the occupancy to increase. So if we are thinking about flexibility of public transport, that would be one single threat for the entire system. As regards the, however, I can also see some opportunities because pandemic, not only in Poland but across the world, helped decision makers to make important cuts regarding the individual vehicle traffic in city centers. And so spaces were reduced for cars, and also public transport gained new space owing to that. Well, I'm sorry that your minute is up. So Robert, now your minute starts.
Very quickly. Well, the chance and the opportunity is that the public transport is not the past but the future. Let's in a very general way. And the threat, I think, might be that we would idolize solutions of the past, like, for example, electric cars. I mean, they seem very innovative, but in the end, they're just cars with batteries instead of combustion engines. So, and I think my hope is in a generation of mayors who understand that we need to change our cityscapes and in order to sort of nudge people into choosing, let's say, more sustainable and more healthy modes of transport than others. I mean, our cities are, even in Europe, are built for cars, and I think they should be rebuilt for people.
Dziękuję. Pan Marcin Żabicki. Minuta lub mniej.
Jasne. Ja podobnie zresztą jak przedmówcy.
As previous speakers, I would like to depart from the thinking of COVID, focusing on COVID, because this is something that may soon disappear, and but we need to think strictly about the Green Deal and the challenges to the planet. We will not able to reduce, however, the levels of pollution, even if we provide the best public transport services. But we should be better able to manage what we already have, and we may need to simply work with what we have for quite some time to come on the regional level. Marcin Domański, the floor is yours. As regards the emission levels, well, the public transport reduces emissions, definitely. And there is a great opportunity for accelerate introduction of new technologies in public transport, which will, on one hand, help reduce cost, on the other hand, will offer completely new possibilities to passengers. And as regards threats, there is a risk that the financial situation of local governments may be more difficult in a short perspective, and there may be a situation in which the simplest solution is to simply limit the provision of transport. And now, Mr. Steriu, the floor is yours. Mr. Steriu, the floor is yours.
Chyba nam się łączność urwała.
We cannot hear you. Yes, your image is frozen.
Trudno, to niestety jakiś chochlik
And
internetowy nam się tutaj
unfortunately, this must be some issue with the internet connection. Well, we have 1 minute left, so I will use it to express my gratitude to all our guests for their important contributions and very interesting ones at the same time. And I would like to also thank everyone present taking part here physically, also everyone that has been watching us online. I'm grateful to the team, technical team, including the interpreters and the technical team constantly fighting with the technical malfunctions. And the last 30 seconds allow me to invite you for to the next meeting, which will take place on the 7th of December. It will be organized online, and it will be a meeting of the Transport Observatory, during which we will be talking about railway transport. So we will be talking, and we'll also be showing you things, but more information on our website. Thank you for today, and see you next time.